So, good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to see you here all again. We are the Lieblinghaus, the White City Center, a prolonged arm of the municipality of Tel Aviv and the German Building Ministry. And in this research lab, we're welcoming researchers we invited to work with us or interesting topics that we find relevant for the times we live in. And today I'm very pleased to introduce two speakers connected to the film Whose City? The first of them being the filmmaker Hans Christian Post, a documentary filmmaker. He did a film in 2015, Last Exit Alexanderplatz, this film Whose City, and currently working on a film in Copenhagen. His primary field of research is cultural and urban memory. He also teaches at Southern University in Denmark, study of culture, and he's written extensively on city planning, building preservation, memory, history, and politics. And the other guest I want to introduce is Philip Oswald, almost a dear friend already. I'm very happy that you're here, Philip. Philip was head of the Bauhaus Foundation. In his period, also reconstructed Mises Trinkhalle and the Master Houses, which we might be able to talk about a little bit later. He has worked on projects such as the Urban Catalyst and Shrinking Cities. He's an author of many books and an active professor at the University of Kassel for theory of architecture. So we are going to talk a little bit about Berlin today and try even to connect what is happening in Berlin to what's happening in Tel Aviv, perhaps. I must say that I was lucky enough to have lived in Berlin as well for almost 10 years, so I know the city quite well. And when I came there, it was about 2000. Somebody told me, oh, you just missed the really good times of Berlin, you know? It was after the wall already fell down and the whole party scene, Tresor, it was very active, but already the feeling was, okay, it's already post-coolness of the city. So I have the feeling Berlin is in a constant sort of passage, not really being in one sort of timescape, but rather always trying to find where the next step is going to take it. So what has led you, Hans, to actually base your research in Berlin, and what led you to make this very interesting film about?
The reason why I made the film was that I lived in Berlin for 7 years. And during this time, I studied at the university, and later I started writing a PhD on the urban competition for the Alexanderplatz. And since I had been living in Berlin for some years and had also been working in the documentary film industry, my Danish supervisor encouraged me to also make a documentary film at the same time as I was writing the PhD. Since I was anyway going to interview the people who had been involved in the competition, which took place in '93. And the urban competition for the Alexanderplatz, which is depicted in the film Last Exit Alexanderplatz, was a very controversial urban competition. And there was a big dispute in relation to the competition. So this was one of the things I was talking with the people about when I interviewed them. And this, you can say this Alexanderplatz dispute was part of a larger dispute which took place in the early 90s in Berlin, which was a general architectural dispute where many things were discussed, but above all, the question, how are we going to rebuild Berlin? How are we going to connect East and West? And what architectural styles or what architectural languages would we like to use in this connection. So when I conducted the interviews for the film about the Alexanderplatz, I also spoke about the architectural dispute in the early 90s. And once I had finished the film on the Alexanderplatz, I had still this material which I found, which was very interesting. So I decided to also make a film about this architectural dispute. And in the beginning, I thought, well, I'll just reuse the material I have, the material I didn't use. But instead, I decided to conduct many of the interviews anew and to add some new voices also. And I also wanted the film to not just be about the architectural dispute, but to sort of be see if there was a connection between the architectural dispute, what was disputed, but also what was not disputed, what they didn't talk about, and the development we have been seeing over the last, above all, the last 10 years, where the city is growing ever more exclusive. Yeah.
So, Philip, how would you pin the dispute? What is the dispute really about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is very much a kind of zeitgeist, I mean, connected to the reunification of Germany. And it was also the look for some kind of formulation of national identity, which is, of course, very tricky in the German context. And so in the early 90s, it was, I mean, the propagandists like Stimmann and Kohlhoff and Neumeier and other ones really used quite a kind of the arsenal of nationalistic argumentation. In a sense, I would say it's like an early glimpse of what we experience later of right-wing populist voices. Even so, I mean, these people are Democrats, no question. But obviously there was a feeling of what was going on. And we have, I don't know if it's known in Israel, we have a pretty right extremist former social democrat, Theo Sarrazin, was very much arguing against refugees and so on, and about the loss of German identity. And Mr. Stimmann, who was the Senatsbaudirektor, so the head of the building department, he was called the Sarrazin of architecture, which says quite a bit what this was about.
So first of all, Hans, I would maybe ask you to just lift your camera a little bit so your whole face. That would be great. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting time you did your research in. Of course, a lot of projects, not only the Alexanderplatz, but later also Project Philip, you were involved with the Palast der Republik and other Bauakademie or the Schloss and many others were projects that always sort of touch the Berliner in its guts. It's like it's always maybe a dispute between who are we now? What's Berlin now? What is it going to be? It's the period of the Weimar Republic. Is it the wiping out of the history of the city in all its terms? Is it forgetting of Berlin? And all this was kind of wanting to get together and create a new sort of city. So the big debate I found very interesting that you mentioned, Hans, in the city was, do we kind of create an urban landscape that is somehow unified and is can be read as one? Or do we give place to sort of new ideas of urbanism and architecture in a sense? So after your interviews, do you think that the debate is still the same, or do you think that Berlin actually learned from what it has done in the 90s and would do it differently now?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the right one to answer this question, because I don't really know what's going on in the city at the moment, in Berlin at the moment. But I mean, I think the people in power now are doing a better job, or at least the intentions are better. I mean, now we have a new Senatsbaudirektorin, Regula Lüscher, and I think she has a more diverse perspective on the city and how the city is to develop. I mean, she was also coming to Berlin, to West Berlin in the 80s and to Berlin in the 90s, and she really liked what she saw. All the things that the Stimmans of this world didn't like, she appreciated this. She appreciated the diversity, and she also, when I spoke with her, she also has this idea that the city, we have to leave spaces for new developments, for future developments. So, I mean, she's aware of this, but at the same time, I think she says that the city has sold so much property, probably above all in the 1990s. I think it was Saracen who actually conducted this, as the city was almost broke, and so the city also in a way lost a little bit power in this sense, the chance to really define how the city is to develop. That's my impression, and that's also what she's been telling me since I met her on the premiere, and we had a talk about this, and she said, really, you should also interview Saracen, because he was the one selling out lots of property in the night, I think. And by doing this, the city really lost some of the chances that the city actually possessed in the early 90s. And
so
also
they were selling it to the higher bidder, to the highest bidder, no? It's like this was like, there was no real agenda, but really it was just put for sale.
Exactly, yeah.
And Philip, do you think there is still something to do about that? Because Berlin now has lost a lot of property, and has put a lot of, you said it, and you see that in a film that Hans made, a lot of mainstream sort of shopping malls and new projects for foreigners with money. And what do you think the state in Berlin is now, and how can you balance between the need to reconstruct the city, bring money in, and between the will or the wish of the citizens to leave the city as it is and create even places for social housing, etc.
Yeah. So I mean, pick up a phrase you just used. I think it's more about keep money out than bring money in. I mean, the issue is, since 2008, after the crash of the financial market, that enormous amounts of money look for kind of long-term investment. And as in Berlin, still the real estate prices was not very high, enormous amounts of money from many countries, including Israel, actually, have been invested into Berlin, actually with just kind of raising prices, not necessarily kind of building much. I mean, much money is absorbed by investment and what means investment, by buying out the existing housing stock. And this is still going on. And I think, I mean, of course, there are calls to depropriate big owners. Yeah, so there's big associations and stock market firms which own quite high numbers of apartments, about more than, I think, 100,000 apartments in Berlin only. And so there is a call to depropriate, which is not very likely to happen, but at least the call is interesting, I would say. And but I think in general, the solution is probably less to get the property back. I mean, in small amounts, it also bought back now for the triple of the price, which is unbelievable. So the city is buying back its own property? For the triple of the price. So like if they sold, take an example, a case was in Spandau. If they sold like housing for 100 million, they rebuy it for 350 million now, 10 years later. I mean, it's really completely crazy. And they also buy individual houses like Kreuzberg Friedrichshain. They buy kind of single houses if there is enough protest to criticize private ownership. But so that has really changed very much. So I think still you experience a good time, but the effect of the stock market crash and the financial crisis was enormous on Berlin since 2008 and still going on. And I mean, the property question now becomes really kind of a major question in the public discussion. And I think that's very good. It's a question of how far we get with this discussion, but at least there is an understanding that this is really a major issue. In Munich, they are more advanced in this sense. In Berlin, we are now at the step where they call for a concept process. So if you buy something from the city, you still can buy, but you need to provide a concept. And so the decision is not based just on the highest bid. In Munich, they completely stopped to sell, which I think would be necessary. They just do leasehold. So they don't sell anymore to private investors, which I think is absolutely necessary. And I also think that the things which you have in Canada and Denmark and Poland, I would also limit the possibilities for foreign investors because they just buy and put money into the market, but they do little. And I think we need to have a strong relationship between the people who use the buildings and the ones who own it.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that they're also like selling really to people who sort of put a plan down for the next future in which they engage the surrounding, the population living around it, maybe create some jobs, some culture. But you don't think that's a good idea. You think that the planning should be top down from the municipality?
No, but I'm just saying, I think that the property of the ground should be public because it's like a major driver of speculation. And you have cities like Amsterdam or Hong Kong, which have a long tradition in this. So it is not something, I'm not completely anti-market. I'm just saying like the real estate, I mean, the ownership of the ground is something which you cannot multiply in a city, where you had the market function is not really working. And there is, I mean, it's a limited resource. And I think it's much better off if you just lease it out. And the building stock, that can be privately owned. And this is a model which really works well. And I don't see any reason not to do this.
Well, if we compare Berlin for 1 second to Tel Aviv, or even if you look at, you know, our subject, no, the White City is dealing, the center, the Living House is dealing with the White City, and you know, this is a heritage zone, a very large one, and you know, it's under protection of UNESCO, and you also know that we're building up, no? It's like we actually kind of rely on outside money in order to regenerate the heart of the city. So I'm wondering if we always have to think that private money is not good for a city, or if we can sort of direct it with regulation to actually reshaping or I don't know, or perhaps helping the city to revive. No, I mean,
I'm not against. I'm not against private money, but maybe it's also interesting what Hans has to say. But I mean, listen. I mean, also in Tel Aviv, the price of an apartment in the White City, I don't know what it is, about like $6,000-7,000 a square meter, or 10.
Yes, something like that.
Yeah, like that. Which is far more than to construct this. I mean, there is like a high amount of this cost is not for the construction of the building, but it is for the speculation on the location of the building. Yeah. So, and this is something what I'm criticizing. I'm very much for kind of getting many people involved. And actually that is about exactly the point. I can say I'm living here in Berlin, Schöneberg. I'm still living in Berlin. And this is a neighborhood. We have had a former tramway depot. which is now used by the police, and the police is asked to move out. And then this was supposed to come on the market. And the idea was by the Green Party that this is kind of sold in a concept procedure. Yeah, so something you might sympathize with. And then there was a public gathering, there was a participation event, and all the people from the neighborhood said, no, we don't want this. Because, I mean, it's very simple. The real estate is as big that you need at least 50 million euros in order to begin with. Yeah. So who has 50 million euros in the pocket? And this is something, these amounts of money, they are far too big in order for most of us to participate. And the interesting question is how to organize kind of city development also by people who have less money. It is very problematic if all the decision of city making is done by people who have 100 million euros or more. I mean, that is really a very, very selective, very problematic choice of actors if only kind of the very, very rich are the ones who decide about the city. And we should, and this exists, we should kind of favor models which also allow people which have far less money to participate in the building production. And then you come to the question of the Baugruppe, then you come to the question of the housing cooperative, yeah, of the housing associations, where there is very different forms, or there are some different forms to activate private people's money in small amounts in order to do something.
Mm.
I think maybe for the Israeli crowd, if you could just give some example of this Baugruppe, because I saw some very good examples in Berlin, even architects, you know, known to not have so much money, like, you know, us perhaps, get together and really think about living together in sort of a few blocks of buildings and creating a project. Can you give some examples for that, and how it worked?
Yeah, I could describe the model, but maybe Hans Christian had also to,
yes, please.
So, the point is that you get like 10 to 50 people together, which are, it is not social housing, it's like middle class housing, but they could kind of afford doing this houses a little bit lower than the market price to far higher quality. And they get together with an architect, they look out to get a site, and then they buy the site and develop this together in a kind of collaborative process. Interesting point about this is that the collective of the 10 housing owners or 20, they decide together about the architecture. Interesting is also as they kind of look to have not too much cost, they also choose very tricky sites. So they would also build in sites which a normal investor didn't use to build. And they are also doing apartments which are not standard market type, because they know their own desires, they're built for themselves. So they're interested in architectural solutions which kind of cover their needs and not like the average 2 to 3 room apartment. And so this is a way not only where you kind of lower a bit the price, but also which allows to have something beyond kind of the total standard market apartment building. And that is,
yes, good architecture. Yeah, that's true.
I think in Copenhagen, we have no examples of this. We had Christiania in the 70s, but that was a very different time and a very different city. But I have some friends who have been in a collective project like this for years. It's a big group, I think also 50 people or so. And they have really been talking about this for years, but they cannot find the spot for it because the prices are too high. And these people end up instead moving out of the city and finding a village somewhere or establishing a village somewhere. And in this way, they sort of realize their ideas. But to do it in the city, as the prices are currently in Berlin or anywhere else, in fact, I think that's very, very difficult. So it should be something that the city should decide to allow for, that the city should decide we want this sort of use in the city as well. Also, we want the city to to be payable, to be livable for all sorts of groups, and therefore we should reserve some attractive spaces. And as Dubau says in the film, not just at the very far end in the periphery of the city, but also in the city center. If this is something the politicians are able to, I don't know. I mean, to do so, they have also to own some property to be able to sort of force investors to build in certain ways, to plan in certain ways, or to be able to reserve areas for this kind of use, for low-income housing or for collective projects where the people themselves get to plan, get to decide. I don't know how it is in Berlin at the moment, if this is something Berlin would be able to, but I think still Berlin is sort of slowly growing aware of that it is an attractive city and that it has something to offer. And that was the 2000s, where the city was very close to being broke and wasn't very self-confident, and therefore sold out at very low prices a lot of property. Yeah.
Yes, but let's really talk about this idea of middle class and even lower class living in the heart of the city, like you mentioned in your film. And let's talk about really this modernist idea that was developed in the 20s of social housing and social housing projects, which we can still see in Berlin a lot. Even 6 are nominated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Mm-hmm. But even I think more interesting is also the discourse later, maybe Philip, with you, about the shrinking cities and their sort of maybe failure after the development of such modernistic social housing settlements. So my question to you is, what do you think should be or should not be done in the case of social housing in the heart of the cities?
Okay, it's a big question. I mean, if you look at back in the 20s, of course, as you said, in the Weimar Republic, there was about 300,000 housing units built as social housing, financed by taxation of existing housing stock, among others, and built by cooperatives or municipal housing associations.
So now we can see how joined together politicians are with the idea of having all groups live in the center of the city, how architecture is so political in the end. No, it's like
absolutely,
it's just a different era. Yeah,
this was really successful, and this was a kind of a reaction, a response to the speculative housing production which was there before the World War I. I mean, the kind of Gründerzeitviertel of Berlin, the kind of from the late 19th century, that was built upon speculation in very bad quality of housing for the way it was used at the time. And kind of based on this, kind of the idea of reform of architecture was developed, and it was only implemented, or was only possible to implement by new actors, which was like the municipality, mostly social democratic governments, combined with cooperatives and the labor movement and so on. And this is actually kind of, even though the white city of Tel Aviv is stylistically quite related to these housing estates, of course, the building production in Tel Aviv was more like a bourgeois production of private owners, which is also okay, but it didn't have this kind of social agenda beside the few projects by Ari Sharon we all know very well and admire. And so that is also, I think, part of the issue that Tel Aviv was so intensively gentrified, because this is all private ownership and was kind of up for speculation. In Germany, sadly, quite a few of these housing estates of the 1920s was also sold. Like in Berlin, the very famous Hufeisensiedlung in Pritz, for example, is now owned by Neue Wohnen and Deutsche Wohnen, and this is also true for other housing estates. So they're also privatization occurred. So that's quite sad. How to do today? Okay, it's a huge question. I mean, the issue is that there's many issues involved. It's quite complicated because also the way social housing was produced after World War II was quite problematic. It was the financing model only ensured for 30 years of low rents, and now this is all fading out because the housing stock is getting old. And the one issue is that it's sold to private investors, but the other issue is that the rent limitation is fading out because of the former financial model, which was very advantageous for the investors building at the time. So it is quite tricky how to re-establish kind of affordable housing again. But I would argue, as Hans Christian, and I think also you sympathize with that, we need a diversity of actors and we need kind of social engaged actors, non-profit actors, and there are then the Baugruppen is one thing which is not necessarily very social because it's like middle class housing, but we need like more cooperative housing, but maybe not the huge cooperatives we used to have after World War II, but more smaller ones, and that needs to be stimulated. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I could maybe add that also in the 1920s it was quite difficult to do this social housing. I mean, Martin Wagner, who was involved in it, had plans for the city center. That's actually the model they wanted. They wanted to have cheap housing also in the city center. They wanted these Gründerzeit buildings that were driven by speculation. When they were built, they wanted to have something else instead. They wanted to have this functionalist, modernist social housing instead of that. But in the end, where they built was actually in the periphery. Neukölln-Britz was at the outskirts of the city back then. Reinickendorf, where the White City is also sort of northern outskirts. I would say also Onkel Tom's Hütte is western outskirts. So it was very difficult to do this in the city center. And of course, you could say there wasn't also the same need as there was after the Second World War, when the city was divided, when the city was also was destroyed during the Second World War. There was more need, you can say, actually, to rebuild the city center. So Martin Wagner, they had many great ideas, but it was to realize them was not so easy. Mm-hmm. The model we have now in Copenhagen is that anytime something is built in every neighborhood where something is built, 25% of that has to be social housing. So if one building is built, 25% of that ideally should be social housing. So that's a different model than to say we'll build a complete estate which is only social housing. We've tried that. That wasn't very successful. Some of these neighborhoods turned into what's been called ghettos and are still called ghettos today. The new model is to every neighborhood that's built, we have 25% social housing, and then we have also living units. But the problem is, of course, that the social housing which is built is still incredibly expensive. It's very expensive, yeah. Because the general prices are so high. So, I mean, we would have difficulties affording social housing in Copenhagen if we were to move to one of these new apartments. So, so that's something that has to be solved, and I think there are probably solutions in every city. The reason why it's so expensive in Copenhagen is because the city is financing its new metro lines through what's being built. And they have an interest in selling at the highest prices possible. And at the same time, they sort of block for new developments because they want the prices to stay high. So they don't want lots of new houses being built or apartments, because that would bring prices down. They want to finance their, their metro. And for this reason, the city is becoming very, very nice, very green city, as they say, with new fancy metro lines, but it's also very, very expensive. So, yeah.
Yes. Back to you, Philip. You were right to say that the White City is not the case of what was built in Germany in terms of social housing. But later on, after the establishment of the state, we did copy the idea of the Zeilenbau to, you know, Tel Aviv, we're not right in the center, but not the center, or a bit east and north and south of the center. And those Zeilenbau typologies are actually sitting on a valuable land. The case now is that we're trying to find solutions. Some of them are even under conservation, but the problem is that most of them are not, and then they're teared down. And the whole typology was actually the beginning of in the essence is nice, because you have all those green belts. I don't know if those houses themselves are so interesting architecturally wise, but you know, the whole surrounding makes a very much community sense, and people just love those strips of land in between those buildings. And the city that was shifted sort of in those lines is now shifted back to face the street and has now high rises. So this is the case of many, unfortunately, of those social housings built after 48 in the peripheries, or back then in the peripheries, now in the center of Tel Aviv. So my question is sort of back to the topic the Lieblinghaus is dealing with, preservation. Like, how much of those ideas should we keep, and how much can we as planners of today or thinkers of today change in order for the ideas of the past to fit to the society today? Or is it our task at all? I don't know. Sometimes I feel architects today don't have the same task as they did maybe in the 20s and 30s, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, of course, this has definitely changed it kind of in the years between maybe mid-19th century and mid-20th century. The main goal of architects was to construct anew. And I think we are much more now in a condition where, at least in our countries, if it's Israel or Germany, we have the higher part of the building stock is existing, and we have rather to deal with the existing building stock than just to construct new. And I think Israel Godovich showed me 2 years ago, I think, some of these examples you just mentioned. And I think he was very concerned about this. And I think he's completely right that it is necessary to widen the scope regarding the kind of heritage, not just focusing on the white cities of the early 30s, but that this is also kind of a very valuable building heritage. I would, in general, think, but this is of course something where there is not a kind of a general rule, but I would generally think that of course, we are always transforming what is given to us from the former generation, and there is, of course, also possibilities to keep. If we take like the architects very known, Lacaton-Vassal, and say demolish, only add. I mean, there are, of course, possibilities also for the Zeilenbausiedlung to kind of increase the density without demolishing what is there, which is not only a question of like architectural culture, but it's also a question, of course, of ecology, how much kind of gray energy we are losing by always demolishing and building anew. And I think there are interesting possibilities to really kind of develop what is there, also to increase the density. But I think in this particular case, one also needs to discuss the quality and value of the green spaces. And the question is, I think, I mean, what you gain and what you lose, and I think that you have some green spaces in the city is also something quite valuable. So it cannot be only about building density. Also, green areas have a program, have a value for people and for the youth. So that has to be kind of seen in a holistic sense. But of course, you can develop an existing condition.
Yeah, I think the same. I think you have to look at every case individually. If it's okay just to preserve it like it is and not change it in the widest sense possible, or if it would be okay to densify, to add things, and then of course the question how to add, what to add, in which language to add. In the 1990s, there were some plans to densify the Hansaviertel in Berlin, which was built after the war for this international Bauausstellung 1957, and I mean, of course, Hansaviertel is an important landmark, also in connection with what was happening on the other side of the wall with the Stalin Allee, today Karl Marx Allee. But I can also see the argument for maybe densifying something as the Hansaviertel. I mean, not that, yeah, I don't know, but so instinctively, I don't have so much against the thought of densifying something like the Hansaviertel. But what they planned to do was to add something that was similar of Gründerzeit. They wanted to add these building blocks of the 1900s, so to add a language which somehow didn't match that was built in the 1950s. So I think if you decide to densify something like that, you should at least try to honor what was there, what's standing there, and the style and the language that was employed back in the day, by not imitating, but somehow still build in accordance with that. And at the same time also mark that this is something new, this is something else, this is something that has been added. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say. I have to say, I mean, there's basically the Hansaviertel, and we have another, I mean, this has died, but we have another example of the Marx Engels Forum. And so there is this big open space in the city center in East Berlin, which was developed in the GDR, which I think is very nice and can be kind of improved, of course. But I mean, the generosity of the space is really kind of in a good scale for the city and all of that. And there are plans to kind of build up the kind of medieval city there. I mean, so ridiculous. And I mean, similar to the example you mentioned with the Hansaviertel, this is not about the capacity to gain place for housing units. I mean, forget about it. This is a kind of symbolic fight to redefine the city and its image and so on. So I think so. There, the one discourse you have about kind of giving capacity for housing, and this is and the other one is kind of using densification as a tool to change the identity of a city.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it brings me back to another point that was mentioned in your movie, Hans, and I think Philip, perhaps you touched upon it a little bit. The topic of critical reconstruction. No, I mean, Berlin was dealing with it a lot, especially in the 90s after the wall came down, and big projects like, I don't know, Alexanderplatz and others had to build themselves up again. Mm. So I know you are really in the heading some of the most interesting, perhaps, debates about critical reconstruction. Perhaps you could let us in on one of them, maybe the Bauakademie or something like that.
Yeah, I mean it's a big subject, which is so everybody speaks, and I think that's probably also the perception of our listeners, even in Israel, that there was a like reconstruction wave in Germany since the 1980s, still ongoing. Mm-hmm. Interesting point is to note that, I mean, it doesn't mean that there was an increase of the number of reconstruction. There was reconstruction since 1945, and there was modernist architect who did reconstruction. There was modernist architect who even propagate historic reconstructions in the one sense or the other. The point is that the kind of political and ideological agenda changed. And the cupola of the Reichstag is exactly the shifting point. Forster was fighting so hard not to really literally reconstruct the cupola. He didn't want to have any cupola there. He was thinking of like a light structure, whatever, very functionalistic and so on. And he was really kind of saw himself in the tradition of like the kind of modernist buildings of Bonn, of the state architecture from the kind of Western Germany of the post-war decades. But the client, which was the German parliament, was so resistant and was so much insisting getting his historic cupola. So in the end, it became a compromise. So he was taking the silhouette, more or less, of the historic cupola, but he was insisting that it has kind of a function, which it didn't have in the beginning historically. And so he kind of gave it kind of a public function that it can be accessible by the ramp. He gave it kind of an energy function that it provides light and a kind of a passive cooling. And so, and this was something which only was possible because Forster, as a kind of very renowned architect, gave it kind of enormous importance to fight it through. And even so, it became a compromise. Now, later in the castle, which was just opening these days, even such a compromise was not more possible. Now we have like this completely ridiculous cupola from 1850s with a reactionary, anti-democratic slogan on top of it, yeah. And this is, I mean, that is where we are now in this type of buildings. And I don't know what the future will bring us, but this is really kind of in this kind of using architecture as a political tool to kind of normalize German history, to go back to times before the Weimar Republic. And this is really irritating, even so I think that the promoters of these projects are kind of not politically problematic, but I mean, the idea of architecture is problematic. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was a very funny part in the movie, Hans, you made, where one of the speakers, I can't remember his name, said that the politicians, they really don't speak language of architecture. For them, it's like, you know, Traufhöhe is like something that I really have to look up. So that's really interesting. But in this topic, I want to touch something else, which is, of course, politics and city planning and architecture, and talk about fascist architecture in Berlin and the way it is used, or the debate around if we should conserve buildings that had a role back in the 30s as sort of a Nazi propaganda or not. So I think this is also a very interesting debate. I mean, what are we, or how should we judge if a building should stay or not, culturally, socially? Yes, what do you think about that?
Well, I think we should preserve the buildings of the Nazi era, and this has also been done in the 1990s. Of course, after the war, several buildings of the Nazi era were destroyed, and probably also for good reasons. Also in Berlin, but also in Munich, and so on and so forth. In the 1990s, they decided, once the reunification came, and once it was clear that the ministries are moving back to the city, the embassies are moving back to the city, they decided to reuse these Nazi-era buildings. I think in many cases they did a good job. They didn't just take it over and say we'll pretend that no history took place. Instead, they actually pointed out the history, the dramatic history of the architecture of the buildings, especially the Bundesfinanzministerium, which was before then, I think, the Zentralkomitee of the GDR era. But before that, it was Goebbels, no, not Goebbels, it was Göring's Luftfahrtministerium. So it has this building has a very interesting and, of course, very dramatic history. And this has been pointed out in the way things have been preserved, in the way things are pointed out in the building, on the architecture, but also they employed an artist, Jochen Geertz, I think is his name, to sort of make installations that would point out this history of the building. So there was a sort of an Aufarbeitung, you could say, a dealing with this history of this architecture, which I think is very important. Yeah.
No, I think, I mean, I completely agree, but the irritating thing is that this kind of attitude was not possible with the East German, with the buildings of the GR time. Mm-hmm. And that is really irritating. I mean, of course, there's to some extent, you can say it is about that there is like the anti-modernist understanding by quite some of the politicians and in the public, where they have more difficulties to kind of deal with a GDR building than with a Nazi building. But I think also that the ideological desire for destroying GDR buildings was much higher than to demolish Nazi buildings in the 1990s. I mean, I think that was like, one was more relaxed about at the point in time. There is one strange exception, which I don't have a kind of final opinion about, but I'm irritated about the Haus der Kunst in Munich, which now is by Chipperfield, really kind of redone in its very original fashion. So he is not taking a critical view, but he says Trost was a good architect. And so he's really putting the building in the renovation back to like a former status, which I am really skeptical about without kind of having been very deep into this question. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think it was also in the architectural dispute. This was a topic that they were saying: what architecture do we like, and what architecture do we dislike? And Nazi architecture was highlighted as good, solid Prussian architecture, sort of, and GDR architecture and modernist architecture in general, but also Weimar architecture was sort of criticized for many reasons, but also for not really being German, for being international, speaking international language and so on. And I think Kohlhoff is very much a fan of this Nazi era architecture. At least he is a fan of Mussolini sort of style architecture, and Lampugnani, who is in the film also, is also very much a fan of at least Mussolini style architecture.
Yeah, this kind of long and narrow windows are very much in fashion in Berlin, no? It's like somehow they remind me of Speer's architecture in a way. I don't know why, but it's...
Kohlhoff builds in this language still. Also, he has just built in Dresden, and what you see there reminds very much of this, of at least Mussolini style architecture. And I think, you know, the Luftfahrtministerium von Göring is an architecture that sort of makes you feel small. It's an intimidating, monumentalistic architecture, but it also, to me at least, has some beauty. And I think, but at least it's very ambivalent, and yeah, it's not just purely beautiful, and it's of course not better constructed or better built or more solid than other types of architecture. That's nonsense.
Yeah, but the question is really if it is more important to create some sort of memorial next to the Brandenburger Tor, or to just really leave traces of the past. That should be voted, I guess. I mean, every city. I mean, Berlin does it I find in a very open and beautiful way to tell its story. I know you are very critical about ruining a lot of the DDR buildings, but still, as somebody from the outside, you have the sense that you can read the city's history without trying to too much, you know, undercover it. But that's only a view from the outside.
Well, what is interesting, I mean, to make one thing which I observed or got in mind, or rather recently, we now kind of discussed both the question of reconstruction and the question of Nazi architecture. What I spoke about, this kind of wave of reconstruction in the 1980s, it was like the return to history in the German architectural discourse. After 1945 until up to the 70s, it was trying to be really kind of forward-looking, present without relationship to history. And the interesting point is that it's not only about the question of the development of the reconstruction movement in the second phase. It is in this very same time is where it starts that the historic sites of the Holocaust, of Jewish culture and so on get rediscovered. So on the one hand, you have, and this starts actually in Frankfurt with the Börneplatz, where they find that the origins of the traces of the historic Jewish ghetto are not demolished. It's in the early 80s and mid 80s, and then it comes to that kind of initiatives to have the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, to have the Haus der Wannsee conference, the Topographie des Terrors, and all of that. This is kind of starts in the 80s and kind of goes on in the 90s. And this is the very same moment where the reconstruction wave starts. Yeah. So this is somehow like, so the left-wing liberal people are fighting for these historic sites of the Holocaust, of Jewish culture and so on. And then you have like national conservatives who fight for the reconstruction.
It's interesting. It's almost like postmodernism, no? It goes hand in hand with this kind of architecture that tries to give quotes within its structure itself.
It's postmodernism. I mean, the postmodernism starts already in the mid-70s, and in the beginning, postmodernism is just kind of to reuse historic elements of the language, but in a playful modernist way. And in the 1980s, it becomes really kind of going back to the history, and then it becomes also very serious, both with the memorial sites, but also with the reconstruction. And then it's not anymore, I mean, the whole reconstruction discourse in Germany, it's not at all playful. It is about a very orthodox literal reconstruction of the outer appearance of the historic buildings. I mean, you cannot debate with anybody of these gang to how to do a reconstruction. It has to be identical with the photographic image which is there. And so that is really beyond postmodernism.
But I think when you talk about the critical reconstruction, that was introduced in the 1980s with the International Bauausstellung in 84, 87, and that was sort of a postmodernist critical reconstruction. It was playful, it was citing architectural history, it was also social housing. And it was local. It was in sort of a few different neighborhoods where it was taking place. And at the same time, they also had the Altbau IBA where they were what would you say, not rebuilding, but what is the English term?
Restoration.
Restoration, exactly. Restoring Altbau, which was sort of in not such a good state, and this sort of critical reconstruction I find quite sympathetic. The problem is the critical reconstruction was then taken over in the 1990s by Hans Dimmann, and it became for the entire city center. They made it much more conservative, so it was not playful anymore. It was supposed to look like what it looked like in the past. Of course, it doesn't, but these dogmas of building in stone instead of in glass, and how the buildings should look, the architectural languages that were preferred. It became very conservative, and it was also implemented all over the city. And the buildings that were or the languages that were in the way were to be torn down. So it was not about adding and repairing, it was about changing the image of the city. So it became very dogmatic, and it also became, I think it became destructive in a way, you can say. And above all, modernist buildings were the one targeted, but above all, of course, where it was easy to buy land or buy buildings was in the eastern part of the city. So it was above all GDR modernism, which was singled out for demolition. And the Alexanderplatz was one, of course, important square that was singled out in that connection. But you can also see the Fischerinsel, which is a high modernist neighborhood. They started adding some building blocks. Of course, they don't like Gründerzeit. They don't look like Gründerzeit, but that's the idea that they implemented of the building block. And these have simply been added to the Fischerinsel. So now you have these high modernist high rises from the 1960s, 1970s, and then you have something pretending to look like Gründerzeit. And I mean, I don't know what to think about it. I mean, maybe in 20, 30, 50 years or so, we'll look back and say, oh, those were very interesting times. But right now, it just makes Berlin even more diverse, and I don't know.
Yes, so unfortunately we're out of time. It's a very interesting hour of introduction of Berlin, and was very helpful so much. So I'm sure a lot of Israelis are now go to Berlin or after the pandemic allows it. And be very informative about what's going on. It was wonderfully made. Thank you so much. The authenticity of the city is what is beautiful and interesting and a good. So I hope we can also learn from the things that happen in Berlin, as well as the mistakes, and imply on our little metropolitan here in the East. And I'm very much looking to welcome you both, Philip again, and I don't know if you're here, but it would be great to see you here. Perhaps do a movie on Tel Aviv. It's also very interesting. Yes. I would like, yes.
Yes, I could maybe add, we were talking about the current wave of reconstruction in Germany. I just did a film on Dresden, where they do a lot of reconstructions, Baroque reconstructions, also in a very dogmatic way. And this film, I think, will be shown by the EPOS Art Festival, hopefully.
She told me today, yes, that's great.
So, and
great news.
Also the film ends in Berlin with this idea of rebuilding the medieval city right in front of the television tower, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very relevant topic to Tel Aviv as well. Not that we're reconstructing, but when we do conservation, I think that sometimes really we take an image that we think was in the 30s or a picture or something, and do the building just as we think it was in the 30s, tearing out original windows, replacing the plaster as well of everything that is the interior, like the guts of the building, and just leaving the sort of image. And I'm asking myself, you know, what are we leaving? Which sort of story are we telling? And is this the right way to do it? I mean, I'm not talking about all the projects, but sometimes this is the case. So it's very similar, I think, to reconstruction. It's some sort of an image, a cultural, you know, mainstream image that we want to preserve. I don't know if it's the right way or not, but I'm sure there's many other options to do preservation or rebuilding new cities with also memory of the past. So in this sense, I think those topics are very interesting for both Berlin and Tel Aviv. So yes, Philip, I'm sorry that we didn't have time to speak about the Bauhaus reconstruction that you did in Dessau, which I find also fascinating, the way you chose to do reconstruction there. I think it's a very relevant example for what we're talking about, but perhaps we can invite you again to do a lecture just on that. That would be great. So thank you everybody else who was joining us as a listener. Some wanted to ask questions, but then they disappeared. So I'm sorry if I didn't react on time. I was just swept away by the answers of Philip and Hans. So maybe you can write us and then we can post it to them. Yeah. And we would like to invite you for next week. It's a lecture on sagrafito, which is a technique of drawings on buildings that was actually implemented even as a propaganda for kibbutz sort of ideology, socialist ideology in Israel in the 50s. So just, it's a totally different subject, but just as interesting. So unfortunately it's in Hebrew, otherwise I would invite you guys. But to everybody else who is here from Israel, please join us next week. It's by Shai Farkash and Mika Tal. And see you all again, hopefully soon. Be well and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.